the 19th century wears on, the political system created at the end of the Civil War is going to prove to be incapable of governing a 20th century America. And that's really the story that we're going to tell in this chapter. The Panic of 1893 will bring this to a head, but we're also going to see a revolt by the farmers, extreme political polarization, a government that ignores economic crises in the country, and of course, imperialism. Social and economic changes are going to put a lot of pressure on the political system. Between 1876 and 1896, we have a stable party system. It's almost evenly divided. 16 states reliably vote Republican. If you look on these maps, you can figure them out. 14 states, really in the South, reliably vote Democrat. And the elections are decided by voter turnout in a handful of other states. Between 1876 and 1896, the average margin of victory is 1.5%. 3 Republican victories and 2 Democratic victories, although I should point out, in one of those Republican victories, the Democrat actually receives more votes but loses in the Electoral College. The Republicans, actually in 2 of them, the Republicans control the Senate while the Democrats control the House all throughout this period. And so this is a very divided nation politically. Adult white males will turn out in huge numbers. We have a 78% turnout on average during presidential elections in this period, which is about 25% higher than it is these days. Stances on issues were not that distinct. There was not a huge difference between party stances. Voting tended to be based on regional loyalties, and these go back to the Civil War. The South hated the Republicans, as you can imagine. Many Northerners were never going to forgive the Democratic Party. Group identification was a major factor. If you were an immigrant, if you were a Catholic, you almost certainly voted Democrat simply because you saw that as your party. Blacks during this time voted Republican because that was the party of Lincoln. And of course, party machines in cities. As we talked about in the last chapter, every city was controlled by a party political machine. So Catholics, immigrants, the poor, the working class tended to be Democrats. Protestants, middle class, and old stock Americans, people who saw themselves as extending way into America's past, their families anyway, as well as African Americans, tended to be Republican. So what were the issues? Well, one issue was immigration. You can imagine Democrats wanted to make immigration as easy as possible. Republicans wanted to restrict it. Well, this isn't rocket science. This is just because they voted Democrat. Temperance was another issue. Republicans tended to favor banning or prohibiting alcohol, while Democrats tended to not. But that's really the same thing as the immigration issue, because immigrants were so closely linked with alcohol consumption. It was really the same thing. It was a xenophobic nativist reaction. Voters knew very little about the issues anyway, and they generally only stood the party label, the D or the R after the name. Some might argue this is similar to the times we live in now. The national government was very small, although it was bigger than it had been in the past. The federal government did very little outside of running the post office, maintaining the military, which was much smaller than it is today, handling foreign affairs, and of course shooting striking workers. There was one other program that's significant. It's the pension for retired Civil War veterans and their widows. This was a massive program that was kind of something akin to Social Security today, but of course it was only for Northerners. You didn't get it if you were Confederate. A majority of male Northerners, black and white, were on this pension. There was an attempt to make it permanent and universal, give to everyone and have it go on forever, which would be very much like Social Security, but this failed. We did not have a modern national government during this time. Parties and their political machines in the courts were the only real power above the state level. The federal government was relative to today much, much weaker than it had been. Most of the power existed at the state level.